Good morning. So I'm going to talk about sort of where TLC is heading into the future, and with this thing that I'm sure you see buttons and all this about this precision medicine initiative. So that's going to be the topic, but to actually know where we're going in the future, we sort of have to talk a little about the past. So for those of you who do not like or didn't like high school history class, I'm sorry. You just have to, you have to put up with it. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the history. So I'll put it in context for people. And those of you who've been to the conference before, I still think there will be something new to learn here, I hope. So, and it's sort of, reading through things, I have to say, I find that it's a little bit like doing kind of behavior therapy, is that sometimes you just have to do it multiple times and then suddenly it kicks in and you think, oh, I get it now. And I'll explain why. So Francois Lepeau was this French dermatologist that in 1893 coined the term trichotillomania, which he really sort of had, from the Greek for this sort of hair-pulling frenzy or, hair-pulling obsessional quality. And he described this in an adult male who had actually pulled every hair off of his body. To be fair though, early medical books, they were a little dramatic in terms of some of their descriptions, so it may not have been quite that dramatic. But he also referred to trichotillomania as also lacking any cures, that it couldn't essentially be helped. So just keep that in mind for a second. I want to just give the founding person of skin picking. This was a British surgeon, Erasmus Wilson, who around the same time period described skin picking for the first time and referred to it as neurotic excoriation. And he talked about it in anxious people, the old term neurotic for people who were excessive worriers and kind of irrational worriers. And he described this in two young women. And his conclusion was that it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the person to control. And these were really the first time in medical literature that trichotillomania and skin picking were written about. And the reason I mentioned the behavior therapy and kind of thinking about this, I've read these reports numerous times. And it was actually last evening, as I was reading them, I thought, I've got this all wrong. Because, we kind of think, oh, these two people, they're sort of the fathers of trichotillomania and skin picking in some way. Except for, I want to actually put a little different focus on things because of the role of the person. Imagine, if you will, 1893, right? You're a young man, about 16, 17 years old, without the internet. You don't know why you're pulling. And you are going to a dermatologist, and for the first time without anybody else in the world that you're aware of with this problem, you're describing to this person your pulling problem. I find that incredibly courageous and actually pretty amazing that anybody at that time period would have done that. I mean, so I think, even though if you read it, his name's not in the report at all. And it's just the doctor who took credit for it. And even in the case of Erasmus Wilson, the two young women who came in, really pretty amazing at the age of about 16 years old, on separate occasions, to talk about how you couldn't control your picking. And the reason I think that's important is that I think for all that we do in TLC and how the research moves forward, it relies fundamentally on the courage of people to come in and talk to us about their problems. And I think that's both the biggest problem for some people, particularly young people, but I think it's also ultimately the most rewarding for not only the person, but the scientific community, because without that, we wouldn't have anything. So I think that, when I mention this history lesson, I just want to sort of highlight the actual three first people who came forward to talk about it. And I think that's actually fairly amazing. So So you can remember the doctors' names, you know, who cares? They did nothing, they just wrote it down, quite frankly, you know. And as a physician, we'll take credit for a lot of things. So, you know, you can't always, you know, be too impressed by that. So last night I kept thinking, oh, I've been impressed by the wrong person for the last 15, 20 years. So it was a little bit of an eye-opening experience for me. So why should we, from a research and clinical perspective, even care about trick and skin picking? So I'm going to go a little bit further in a history lesson before those people, just to highlight one of the reasons I think that we should care, and what the research hopes to build on, is that these problems have been around since people have been around. You know, a lot of people sort of focus on mental health, particularly they say, oh, you know, you people make up things at the drop of a hat and there's always some new problem. And, you know, these are as old as sort of history of persons. You know, Hippocrates talked about a woman that he knew in the community who pulled out all of her hair in moments of stress. And in one of his books, then, he actually told young physicians as he was educating them to always ask people whether they pluck their hair out, pick at their skin, or if they weep. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the first documentation of mental health problems. And he had 3 disorders: hair pulling, skin picking, and depression. So, I mean, that's pretty, I mean, you know, this is 400 BC, right? I mean, so this is, you know, again, it's not new. These have been around. And then a couple other cases, Homer mentions it in the Iliad about Agamemnon wanting to pull his hair when he was distressed and in grief. And Troilus and Cressida, a play by Shakespeare, also has hair pulling in it in moments of grief and stress over emotional problems, the loss of a loved one. Again, not new. And I would also highlight, it's not as if you know, this was a common, necessarily a typical behavior. They were highlighting this, that in moments of extreme stress and grief, people can do this. They didn't understand it as trichotillomania and skin picking. But the awareness of behaviors go back a long way. The other reason I would say that we need to be very aware of hair pulling and skin picking is these are common behaviors around the world. For the person who's struggling with this and has a hard time with the embarrassment and the difficulty of talking about it, there may be somewhat little relief in knowing this, but I do think it's important because the person may often feel that they're the only one. And these numbers are actually very high, and I'll show what that means. About 1 to 3% of people around the world have trichotillomania, and maybe a smidgen more have skin picking. Now, one could say, oh, 1%, what's that? You know, that's such a small percentage. I want you to put this in perspective with other mental health problems. So if you look at major mental health problems, and this is from some older data from the National Comorbidity Survey in the United States, that if you put trick and skin picking in comparison to all these other problems, which most people have heard of all the time, enormously more common than these other problems, such as anorexia nervosa, or at least as common as other major mental health problems. And again, so I think that that's very important. I know that, again, on a personal level, when people are struggling with something, sometimes they feel very isolated and alone. And this whole conference shows you that's doesn't have to be the case, right? I mean, which is delightful. But I put these numbers up because it is important for, I think, most people to recognize when you go to a clinician and they say, what is that again that you do? You know, and they don't know, and they ask you to spell out trichotillomania, and then you have to spend your hour appointment with them telling them what it is, and you know, I mean, it's, you know, and yet you don't get paid. But the you know, that it's their fault for being ignorant, because very common in comparison to other mental health issues. And also, on a very real level, one of the most important things, and on a personal level, the reason that we want to do more for folks who struggle with trick and skin picking are about the personal consequences of these behaviors. And I think the personal consequences run the gamut, and not everybody has every possible consequence. And some people actually will say that they have maybe very few consequences, or that they had them when they were earlier in life, and then over the years that the consequences are less so. But obviously teasing and bullying are very common, and the sense of shame that people can develop over the behaviors, often because of sort of the lack of awareness on anybody's part and the way that people ask about it and comment on it. General self-esteem problems. In the case particularly of skin picking, which we do know has different consequences, infections can be very real. And this is one of the ways that trick and picking might differ a bit, that when people have excoriated quite a bit, they can get infected, and it can lead to more serious health problems. Also, though, both can lead to general health problems. As I'm sure that many of you know, hair pulling can often lead to obstructions in the bowels. It can lead to problems with dental erosion. And so these are not sort of insignificant, trivial little habits that people have. Obviously, these are very serious problems. And I'm sort of speaking to the choir. I mean, I recognize that. But, I think it's, but I think people should be aware of this, and outside of this community as well. And then I did love, did people go to the posters last night? The posters were really very nice, and you'll see them again today. They're around noon. And the group from American University, David Hage's group, which I really like, they had a wonderful poster on the economics and the costs of particularly trichotillomania, but it also would apply to skin picking. Just the amount of money that people spend trying to camouflage, trying to deal with the consequences. One you can see this in skin picking with cosmetic, the cost of cosmetics, etc. So that there are actually on all levels issues surrounding the consequences of these behaviors. And also Joe Garner, who will be giving a talk at some point during the days, will be talking about animal models. And this is also, I think, why not only people in this room, but everyone should pay attention to trick and skin picking. Because in the mental health field, people are always looking for animal models. Why is that? Because to understand how a little animal's brain works, we can do it so much quicker and easier. They grow up and die, within like an afternoon or whatever it is, and then you can sort of see the whole life trajectory. I mean, it's like a really quick little lifespan. And so you can also, and then ethically and humanely, you can also find out what's going on in the brain of rodents, and I know that there's for the animal people, there's a difference between mice and rats, and I don't pay any attention to that. I throw squirrels into the mix too. They're all sort of things I don't care for. But the reality is that you can then sort of see what's going on in the brain. And trick and picking are really I'm convinced, the only area of mental health that actually has an animal model, that actually works. So that you see all sorts of animals who excessively groom. And so you can see it in all, dogs and cats, and then they wear the cone, because they lick and lick and lick and they get infected. And there are birds that do it, and then they preen themselves and all their feathers fall out, and they keep doing it, and then they sit on a perch and they're like, oh, I can't fly, so I'll just sit and chat today, And so, there's all these sort of animals. So the fact that this exists in nature tells us, one, that on some level, the grooming behavior is incredibly sort of natural. The issue is, why doesn't the sort of off switch kick in? That we all do it. We all groom. We all pick and pull something. I don't care who you are. It can, everybody does it. But why in certain people it doesn't stop? And so the animal models are great, and they don't have them for anything. I mean, they don't have animal models. They have them, they pretend they have them for depression. They've got this thing called the forced swim test, where they have little rodents and they're swimming, and then at one point the little rodent in the water is like, oh, I'm so depressed, I don't want to swim anymore. And so then they sort of say, oh, that's an example of depression. I'm not really convinced. I just think it's, I'm tired and I don't want to swim anymore. So, but so I think that the animal models allow this field to not only help us understand human behavior better, but it actually is a perfect example for the rest of mental health in a way that no other area of mental health can do this. Does that make sense? I mean, so I actually think that trick and picking have the ability, as we understand these behaviors, to actually set a trend for the entire field of mental health. Because we have so many, it's age-old, it's everywhere in the world, it's as common, if not more, than any other problem, and we have animal models. I mean, that's actually incredibly. Now, what we are charged with then is how to use that and how to take it forward and actually help people who have these problems. But the basic sort of structure is there, that actually trick and picking are perfect examples that the rest of mental health can learn from. So now we're going to take a little sort of walk through where the trick and picking field has been over the years. Now, I did a little bit of this last year, and people are like, oh, geez, so much. So I've pared it down to the essentials, and then I'm going to highlight what's been going on recently, And for people in the research world, I think this is very exciting. We have a lot of wonderful developments already and ways to help people, which is the first most important thing. So when you hear about this initiative, and you're like, oh, they're going to do all this research, I've already been pretty well helped by my therapist. Yes, this is great. We have ways to help people now. What we are trying to do is build on this to help more people and have more effective treatments over the long haul. Does that make sense? And so and we can only move forward again when we have an idea of where we've been. So, and it's actually a very short history. The first case of behavior therapy was actually in the early 1960s. This isn't the woman who was treated. This is just a perfect picture of a 1960s hairdo. So, I love her. I think she's great. She reminds me of my sister. So, as a matter of fact, no, it would be strange. That is my sister. So, and she was treated with behavior therapy, and this was really the first case that was written so clinicians around the world could understand that you can actually treat this, after Francois Halibut, who now, you notice I'm going to be really kind of derisive about him now. Now I don't like him at all. And, after he said, oh, it can't be cured, 1963, they actually got a good result with what is called thought stopping, which is a technique actually that has later been used for OCD. And you really just, try to, in a very dramatic way, tell yourself no longer to think about, say, your obsessional thoughts, and in this case, sort of telling oneself to simply stop in a very authoritative fashion. And the case was successful. So 1963, so about 50 years worth of actual treatment. So trick and picking are a bit younger than other areas of mental health, but not without their significant sort of findings. Now, everybody talks about habit reversal. I'm sure many of you have used some version of it. Notice the 1970s hairdo. See, ties in, trick, hair, see? Okay. So, so Azrin and Nunn were the first people who really discussed habit reversal as a technique for any number of habits. And they had, 12 clients with a diverse number of habits. And really, using a single session, were trying to eliminate these habits. And, and you'll see that the components of habit reversal that they talked about are what many people may have already undergone when they've done a variety of sort of habit reversal / cognitive behavior techniques for it, awareness training, competing response, etc. So that they were sort of laying the foundation for this in the early 70s. And we've been building on this ever since. And this is why all findings and all these kind of treatment findings are somewhat incremental. And they're not always perfect, and not everybody gets better. But by learning who does and doesn't, we can actually improve upon things. And this is what we try to do from the research perspective. Then in the 1980s, the highlight of the 1980s, see, Olivia Newton-John, right, and Michael Bolton. So I love these pictures. And You know, so, and let's face it, for many of us of a certain age, if we went back through our photo album, so anyway, you never want photos of yourself sort of out there. Thank goodness there wasn't the internet. So, and this was an important time in 1989 because it was the first medication study that was for trichotillomania. And this really also allowed us to recognize that perhaps medications could be an option for helping these repetitive behaviors. And this was at the National Institute of Mental Health, and Sue Sweeto, who is still there and working on OCD research, was looking at clomipramine, or also called anafranil, and comparing it to this other type of medication, dizipramine, in about 13 people. So a very small study, but it was very important because it's also allowed us to realize that there may be several approaches to the treatment of these problems, and that one of the things that we have to think about is at least what role, if any, medications may help in this too. And then in the 1990s, you know, the research starts getting a little bit more, sort of prolific. We have the first brain scans for trichotillomania. You'll see posters here and research reports on the various findings as we've built on that and done more brain imaging to understand how does the brain of somebody with trich or picking differ from people who don't do the behavior. Family studies were started, behavioral treatments for children, neuropsychology studies, and then the first drug treatment for picking by Daphne Simonone. And this was all during the 1990s. In the 2000s, then TLC funded the first TIPS project, which was the largest survey of people on the internet with trichotillomania to really understand the full complexity of this. And the key about this too is over the years, we go from a single person in 1963, and what we're learning is more people that are interviewed, that are part of the research studies, we learn more, obviously. My grandma could tell you that, right? You talk to one person, what do you know? You know, you talk to 100 people with a problem, you start recognizing the complexity of the problem. You start recognizing the differences in people who have the same behavior. Epidemiological study was done in skin picking, telling us that it was a very common problem. The skin picking impact study from TLC was done, and finally National Institute of Mental Health actually funded 2 grants to Dr. Woods and Dr. Franklin for the study of trichotillomania, which was really phenomenal. Now I just want to highlight a couple things in the past year. So you're kind of thinking, okay, yeah, you know, this is pretty good. But we keep building on this. And this is where I think the research community that is largely, I would argue, most of the researchers are also clinicians. So people try to do the research that's relevant to the people who are sitting in front of them. So some highlights on the trichotillomania side in the past year. See, this is one of those sort of, you know, what's been going on for all of those of you who have not gotten to reading all of your scientific journals. I'm going to summarize for you some of the, and I just picked some things that I thought were particularly relevant to people. So Kate Rogers out of Charlie Mansueto's group actually published what is called the First Step Care, showing that people could start by going to stoppicking.com, an online therapy, and then moving to individual therapy, and actually that certain people might need lower intensity of treatments, and then many people would want a higher intensity and could do very well sort of going from one to the other. Not necessarily that one size fits all. One of the other fascinating studies for the past year was Nancy Kuthin's family study. Now, these people are probably talking about these studies, and they're probably like, why is he telling our results? So I'm giving you kind of the Cliff Notes, you know? So if Cliff Notes still exist, I assume they do. So I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version. So Nancy Kuthin did this fascinating family study where she had folks who had trichotillomania, their relatives, and then some people who didn't have trichotillomania and their relatives, finding out what runs in families. What was interesting about this, I thought, was one of the findings was that people who have trichotillomania often have OCD in their family. Okay? We kind of always knew that. Big deal, right? You know, is that a big finding? But they didn't have higher rates of skin picking in their family. And even though we talk, and I think this is important because even though we talk about trick and picking as sort of almost identical, we have to be aware that there might be very important differences in these behaviors. Many people have both, without a doubt, but we don't want to think of them as simply the same thing, and they might not run in families in the same way. Joe McGuire, and also, what you should also know, a lot of really young people who are doing this research. So young scientists who are committed to trick and picking, and so I wanted to highlight some of theirs. Joe McGuire, who's at the University of South Florida, did a wonderful analysis of treatment for trichotillomania, realizing that behavioral therapy is effective, which we've known. And he actually found that if you added mood elements in the behavior therapy, addressed mood fluctuations, that those studies that did that, people did better than when they weren't having their mood was not being addressed. And so I think that's an important study. And it's worldwide. Folks in Brazil have actually shown this past year that cognitive behavior therapy in a group for trichotillomania can be incredibly effective. This was the first group study looking at cognitive behavior therapy, which they basically did a sort of form of habit reversal, but they did it in a group. And they compared it to just kind of being in a supportive environment and actually found that the therapy was much more beneficial than the group therapy than just a supportive type of therapy. And that one is a brand new study. And what I love about that is it tells us that we can have multiple types of treatment modalities. It doesn't have to be one-on-one, it can be group. And I also highlight that because it shows that people around the world are interested in this. This was done in Brazil. And the fact that people around the world are trying to come up with treatment is what we've needed, because we don't have enough people in any one country really who are doing enough just by themselves. And so it's very important to have an international perspective. Brian Odlog, who has worked with me in the past, did a fascinating brain imaging study of trichotillomania, realizing that certain cognitive aspects, meaning a difficulty stopping a behavior, ran in families. Not the trichotillomania, but the underlying cognitive problem that might give rise to the behavior, that this is running in families. So when somebody says, look, I'm the only one in my family who pulls my hair, it might be actually that the brain of the person who pulls is really identical to other people in the family. They don't pull, but they have the same propensity to sort of be impulsive, for example, not be able to control their behavior. So it may show up in other ways. And that's really very important, because it tells us that when people say, oh, what's wrong with me? I'm the only one in my family. You may actually not be any different from your family members. Your brain might be identical to your family members. It just doesn't show up as pulling in them. Does that make sense? Which I think is really quite important for people who have this problem to understand. Marcia Falkenstein's study came out with race and ethnicity, looking at did those variables influence behavior therapy. And so we're actually moving into the idea that people of all races and ethnicities also have trick and pulling, or trick and picking, and really that needs to be examined as well. And then even the South Africans, and this is the last study there, looked at different parts of the brain in people with trick and people with picking, and actually found that when they looked at parts of the brain, that they're different in folks with picking versus pulling. And one of the differences that they found was that the part of the brain that tells us, do it, do it, do it, I want to do it, I want to do it, is bigger in people with picking than it is in people with pulling. People with pulling, it's bigger than people without either. But so picking big, pulling next, non-picking, pulling third. Does that make sense? You know, and I'll tell you too, to highlight these in Cliff Notes, you know, God love them. You know, academics, we can write endlessly. You know, so I advise you to always, if you want to read the articles, although some of them can be a bit of a snoozer, quite frankly. So, or as my mother used to always tell me when I would send her everything I wrote, she said, "Oh, these are dull. I don't read anything you write." So, it's tough love like that one needs sometimes. So, Now the highlights in the past year for skin picking have been a bit less, and I toss this out there in part because just to let people know there's some work. The same Brazilian group are starting to look at the nutraceutical N-acetylcysteine in a small sample of people. There was a study out of Israel looking at the prevalence of skin picking among people in Israel, finding about 5.4% of people had skin picking disorder. Go back to that first slide I showed you where common. That's about twice as common as all other mental health problems. I mean, that's amazing. And it was a well-done study. And then another study out of Brazil by Ellen Oliveira actually was looking at different types of impulsivity in people with picking, realizing that we could actually give people a paper pencil measure to find out just how much they endorse impulsivity, and it tells us a lot about the differences in people with picking within that same behavior. So I think it's important to recognize there's some picking research. It's woefully behind, in my opinion, from the hair pulling research. We have to do better at that. But given particularly how common it is, but there are some major findings, I believe. So overall, and this has been what the TLC has seen as setting the stage for this initiative in precision medicine. Look, we know a lot about the clinical presentations of these problems, how people come in and talk about their problem. The clinicians around the world have been looking at this, and people, I believe, are very informed about this. We actually know how to measure whether people are getting better or worse using scales that people fill out. We're also really good about understanding co-occurring problems. How common is it for somebody with trichotillomania to have ADHD? So we know all this great stuff so far, and the animal research and genetics and neuroimaging are sort of moving along at a nice pace. And we actually have promising treatments for children and adults that can help a lot of people. I think of all that as the positive. This has been done for decades. I'm indebted to everybody who's done this prior to my work and other people's work, and it's been very helpful for many people who've struggled. So that's the positive side. And as my grandmother used to always say, start with that, and then let people know what the problem is. So, which she was very good at. She'd be like, oh, you look lovely today, and now there are 10 things you do wrong. So, we don't know enough yet, right? We don't know enough about diverse populations. We don't know what's the difference between Jane Smith with trichotillomania and Susan Johnson with trichotillomania? Why does one go to therapy and she's like, oh, I'm so much better, life is great, and the other person says, I did the same therapy, and it didn't do squat for me. Why am I no better? That we don't know. We also still have most of our treatment, as you'll see when people present. They're talking, a dozen people in a treatment study. It's good, but it's not enough. I mean, you think about you read something on the news about a blood pressure problem or a heart problem, and they're like, 8 million people. Okay, maybe not that many, but but there'll be like 80,000 people were in this study about, heart disease. And then, you come here and you're like, 12 people. Yeah, right. So the research is great, but it's still lagging in terms of the numbers. And why do we care? So what's the difference? Because of that complexity. You need a certain number of people to actually allow us to know that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to what we can do to help people. And so the idea is, how can we take those two people, one doesn't respond, and modify therapy for the one who isn't responding to understand his or her unique characteristics and sort of say, based on everything you've told us, we're going to modify this typical behavior therapy, and we're going to change it for you to address these problems. That's where we would like to go, so that actually you're not just getting a cookie-cutter approach, and people are doing that. Don't get me wrong. You go to a therapist, a good trained therapist in BFRBs, they're giving, probably as many of you know, they get more of your life history than you've ever talked to anybody, right? I mean, you spend hours there and you're like, oh goodness, I've said everything possible. And so they use that information. The question is, how can we use that information to an even greater extent to really target so that we can have better success rates in terms of treatment? This all gets back to treatment. It all gets back to how to help people. And I would say, as has been sparked in my mind even at this conference, we also want to use this information to also know who's at risk. And who, so that if somebody has trich and they have an 8-year-old daughter, is that daughter more likely to start pulling or not? And if so, what can we do as an early intervention before it starts? I mean, that's the ideal, right? I mean, so many clinicians were all about, let's fix the problem, let's fix the problem. But we also want to think about how to prevent the problem. And so I think that this is what we're hoping to do with this initiative from TLC. So the looking forward part. Right now we're looking at expressed behavior. Picking, pulling, that's the same gesture, so that doesn't work. Picking, pulling, right? So I'll change my gesture. So, and that's what people come in and say, I do too much of this. What we want to do is start looking layers below that. What's going on in the brain? How are the thought processes different in different people? And ultimately, what's the cause? What's the etiology? How do genetics and environment and developmental things all transpire in a particular person to give rise to this? Because that allows us then to know where we can sort of nip things in the bud. And so that's what we're hoping to get to, because when we only look at the behavior, we have some limitations. So, so the unanswered questions that, and there are many of them. These are my unanswered questions, and some of those that we're hoping to address through this initiative is everyone the same? We already realize that there are some nuanced differences between folks with picking and trich, but even within people who pull, is it the same? I doubt it. I'm sure that you've talked to people and you're like, well, I don't do it because of that. Or I do it because we're a little bit different on that. And so what of those differences are meaningful, meaning what are, that really keep the behavior going and could be targets, versus those that are just personal differences that maybe are less meaningful clinically? Why do some treatments therefore work for one person and not another? And I still swear that's the $10 gazillion question, because I'm sure many of you know, you can find something that works for anybody, right? I mean, some people can do well, and some people just do better just living. I mean, over time they do better without interventions of any sort. But then other people will go to see everybody. I mean, they can go around the world seeing therapist after therapist and trying pill after pill and all this stuff and feel like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get better? And I guess my answer to that is, well, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just that we don't know enough. I mean, that's kind of on us from the clinician side to understand that. And so can we use clinical information, genetics, understanding the brain and how it functions and what's going on in there to actually understand how to get better treatments and also how to create prevention efforts. Now, I should also say, and also the reason is, and nobody, also my grandmother, God rest her soul, she told me a few things. She was brilliant, actually. If she were here, anyway. So she told me, don't talk about politics with anybody. Which is good, right? Don't talk about religion, and never talk about money. Okay, so I'm violating that third one. Because I think that, and because some people are like, wow, this BPM thing that everyone's got these, this is a big thing. And I just want you to know, because I'll tell you, before I was involved in research, I had no clue what any of this stuff costs. And it's sort of a harsh reality of the world, and I'm just telling you, $750 to take a picture of somebody's brain. That's not cheap, for an hour, say, in a brain scanner to have them do little tasks. If you're looking for certain kind of markers in the blood, if you're looking for inflammatory markers to know how the stress response of the body, or many people may have heard about PANDAS in OCD, this autoimmune response, if you try to look for those markers in the blood, a couple $100 for each marker. I mean, I don't justify these costs. I mean, I'm always amazed by it. I always kind of think, look, I'll take a picture of somebody's brain, bring me a pie. But, I was told actually recently the other day, the barter system is not in vogue anymore, and apparently hasn't been in vogue for 200 years. So actually, that was a discussion I had with our director of finance. He's like, you can't ask for a pie. So these things cost. And even to do a small treatment study, when you have like 12 people in a study, it might be like $100,000. That's outrageous. But that's where we are. So I only highlight that by saying that when we talk about the research and people are like, why isn't there more? Why are we not doing more? It has been money. And the people that have been doing the research all over the world, though, I take my hats off to all of them, because people do it on a shoestring. I've always told people that whatever I find in my seat cushions at home, goes toward the research, and you try to do it on a budget and out of dedication, but that has come with limitations in terms of the number of research projects, unfortunately. So this was all, so we were thinking, well, the state of trick and picking is pretty good, we can help people, but we need to do something bigger. We need to really address this in a much more concerted fashion, because everybody who's involved in really the treatment and understanding of trick and picking comes to this meeting. They're part of TLC. And that's also weirdly unique among all health problems. Everybody, for the most part, like 95% of the folks who do any sort of treatment or research in trick or picking come to this meeting. You don't see that anywhere else. And so we thought, how can we use this with everybody here to launch a bigger project? So what's the idea? The BFRBs, these, which we're really kind of limiting to trick and picking, although the term involves nail biting and any number of repetitive behaviors. Really, right now, remission, not response. Response people, maybe it's closer to 40 to 50%, even slightly higher depending on seeing a well-trained clinician. But complete remission, meaning no picking, no hair pulling, maybe is about 10% plus in folks. We would like to see that greater than 70%, in people down the road. And so what we want to do to actually get to that goal is to really understand the brain and understand the biology. And by brain, I don't mean that this includes developmental history, psychological background, because all of that is processed in the brain. My upbringing, my difficulties growing up, get imprinted in my brain. So when I say biology, it does include all of that. So I don't want people to think, oh, that's not important. It is, it's crucially important. Understand then on a molecular level in the brain how we can target treatments better, and then develop both pharmacological as well as behavioral, and modify, not even new ones, modify what we already got, but modify it based on the individual. So the idea of this project is that this is going to be a nationwide collaboration. Again, something that no other area of mental health has taken on, to have every part of the country that has been a part of research in trick and picking to work together. And it works well because we all know each other and actually like each other. So this is a good thing, thank goodness. Well, yeah, because if we didn't, we would say, oh, I'm sorry, you didn't get that phone call. But but everybody is good, and it's a very good collaborative effort. And really, getting hundreds of people involved who have trick and picking to be examined and tell us their stories and everything about their lives, and then to take pictures of brains and get spit samples and blood samples and all these things so that we can really understand what is called the phenotype, which is how people present, and the nuanced differences. If I have 10 people with picking sitting in front of me, I might think, oh, they're all alike. If I have 100, I start thinking, wow, there may be about 8 or 9 different types of picking here. That is really important because that difference allows us to know how to target treatment. Understand the neurobiology by looking at the genetic samples, blood samples, brain imaging, and then to use all of that at the next step to really hone new treatments and to take existing treatments and modify them to best target everything that we learn. This is a multi-year project. It involves these collaborations all over the United States. There are some spots that look a bit empty. That's no disrespect to the people in Wyoming and in Nebraska or places. These are, which are both beautiful. I love Nebraska. Anyway, we won't go on about that. So, but these are targets of people who have been working in the field of trick and picking with TLC as sort of the, the head control center of all of it. And the goal of all of this is that we're hoping that by using all of the most advanced scientific techniques, that we can understand the full complexity of these behaviors and do it as one collaborative, nationwide approach to it all. To really not only move trick and picking forward in terms of being able to help more people, but also set an example for the rest of mental health. That if people really want to understand, I would argue, any mental health problem, people need to do this collaboratively and all be on the same page as to what we're asking and finding out. Because let's face it, I mean, how many times do you even now, you know, find out, oh, this one place published a study and it was on CNN, and, you know, and they said, oh, don't eat, you know, fatty beef, you know, and Anderson Cooper tells you that with a tear rolling down his cheek, don't eat beef, you know. I love him, but he cries all the time. I mean, my goodness. And then the next day, a different CNN report will say, oh, out of a different university in someplace else, they're like, oh, eat 10 buckets of beef a day. You know, and the person's crying there too. I don't know why usually, but they learn to cry. And so we're sort of left with these kind of unknown questions because everybody has their own little samples that are small and they don't necessarily communicate. So the idea here is that perhaps sort of, you know, these sort of more nationwide or even possibly even global, ultimately, collaborations really allow us to everybody sort of know what's being done at the same time and everybody doing it in the same fashion. So I think it really has the ability to move things forward. So so will we find a cure for trick and picking? And see, this is where I will tell you this. They, just between you and me, the TLC and they've purposely avoided using this word cure. I love the word cure because, and I don't, it's not them or us, but you know, mental health never uses the word cure. I'm actually a very big proponent of it. So this is just my own little sort of radical idea, but because I think that, you know, when you use the word cure, your goals are much higher. You know, and so often in mental health, it's all about management. I don't, you know, I want cures. I want just boom, it's gone. So can we, and also I want to use the word cure because Halapo in the 1890s said, oh, you can't cure it. So that throws a gauntlet down. It's one of those things, right? If somebody tells you not to do something, you know, it's the case. I'm like a 5-year-old. If somebody tells me today, oh, don't run around the block, I'll be running around. You'll see me outside, you know. And because I just refused anything somebody tells me not to do, I do it. And I admit, not necessarily the most attractive quality of me, but I do it. So the fact that he said no 100 years later, I'm like, y'all get you. So I always think that, now, bear with me. So a cure, I think we can, and as people say, you know, the old phrase, you know, when pigs fly, you know. So given the fact that this pig is kind of flying, we'll say we should be able to kind of find a cure. That's my goal. So thank you. I appreciate it.